recording. And finally, it's a theology that takes experiences of disability seriously as a starting point for theological investigation and theological reflection. And because it does that, it sort of implied within that part of the definition is that it takes people's embodiment seriously. It's a theology that doesn't, as we were talking about yesterday, it's that separation of the human into a kind of spiritual person and then a fleshly person, and that kind of dualistic split. Theology, disability theology doesn't do that. It looks at the whole embodied experience of the person and takes a variety of embodied realities that include disability seriously in its theological reflection on what it means to be human and other questions. I'm hoping actually during this presentation that people will just chip in with questions as we go. If you feel you have a substantial question that needs a lot of discussion, maybe hold that to the end. But if anything's not clear as we go along, please unmute yourselves and just ask. So we can't talk about disability theology without talking about Nancy Eastland, who really is the most important name in disability theology. She's no longer the most relevant, recent, currently publishing name. She died in 2009, but she is really the person who put theology of disability on the map. She was the Associate Professor of Sociology and Religion and Disability Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. She was born with a congenital bone defect, which caused her to have numerous operations and joint replacements. And she writes about that. It's sort of part of her worldview, as it were, which, you know, her theology is informed by her worldview, and her worldview is informed by her experience of being born with this congenital bone defect. And for those of you who were in the methodology session on dissertation day, I know this is not everyone, but a few of you were there, we spoke about this myth of the neutral point of view in theology, that actually there isn't any neutral point of view. We all write from our specific perspectives. And Nancy Eastland was really among the first to write from a perspective of disability, and it really imbued her work. She contributed to the two distinct fields of scholarship that are disability studies and sociology of religion. And she's best known for her book, The Disabled God, Toward a Liberatory Theology of Disability. I should have put the whole title there, but it's in your bibliography. This was initially just an honors thesis at Candler, but as soon as she published it in 94, it became a classic, and every single disability theology reading list is going to have Eastland on there. Who else might we look at? Well, I wanted to include John Swinton on here because he is, he's actually up at Aberdeen where Katie Cross is. And I wanted to include him on there because he's one of our prominent British disability theologians. He has a background in nursing. He's a registered mental nurse and a registered nurse for people with learning disabilities. And he writes extensively about people with extreme developmental and learning disabilities. He's worked as a chaplain in the healthcare contexts, various healthcare contexts, and he's an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland. So in his work, we get his life experience of being a nurse, and he's a theologian, and he's a minister of the Church of Scotland, and these three things intersect in his work. His teaching and his research are cross-disciplinary in the fields of nursing, medicine, theology, and spirituality. So he's another big name out there. Thirdly, I'm only going to mention three people in this field because three is enough for a first kind of foray into this area. But I want to mention Deborah Creamer, who studied at Vanderbilt University Divinity School and the University of Denver and the Iliff School of Theology in Denver. She's the senior editor of the Association's scholarly journal, Theological Education, and she's the former co-chair and founding member of the Religion and Disability Studies group. That's really her contribution to this field of the American Academy of Religion. So she really helped this big theological studies group, the American Academy of Religion, have something within it that actually discussed disability. And you can see by that, disability theology has been extremely marginal. The AAR didn't have such a thing. And it needed someone to say, well, we need to have a group that looks at religion and disability studies. Her book, Disability in Christian Theology, Embodied Limits and Constructive Possibilities, is a work that we'll be looking at during this session. So having looked at some specific people, let us zoom out a little bit and think about disability theology in general. Now, a few ideas that are prevalent in disability theology are, firstly, that a lot of people talk about relationality within disability theology. And the idea that relationality is a core part of, the pictures are right over what I need to read, and I've forgotten exactly what I wrote up here. Relationality is core to a Christian perspective of human flourishing. A lot of people within disability theology will latch onto that idea of relationality being central. Secondly, a prevalent idea in disability theology is that the church has historically failed to promote relationality between people with and without disabilities, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail too. And thirdly, on a more positive note, people think that there are resources within theological discourse that help redress this problem. And in particular, today we'll be looking at Deborah Creamer's work on limits as one of those theological resources. Oh, my slide won't change. Oh, there we go. So let's look at point one in a bit more depth. Relationality is core to a Christian perspective of human flourishing. It's helpful here to look at Rowan Williams and something that he wrote in Being Human, Minds, Bodies, Persons, which is a great little book. I cannot recommend it enough. SPCK 2018. This isn't particularly about disability theology. It's just about what being human means. And he talks about this idea of relationality in a really helpful way, I think. So he contrasts the individual view of the self with the personal view of the self. The individual view of the self for Williams says, I am the center of the world, one unique example of the group human beings. That's an individual view of the self. The personal view of the self says, I am someone who interacts and engages with others, a point at which relationships intersect, where a difference may be made and new relations created. And this is why we have this lovely gold patterned picture of all these intersecting relationships and the people at the intersections of all these different relationships. At least this is how I kind of visualize it. So in Williams' personal view of the self, I know that my own point of view is always partial, and I recognize that I am a node point in a web of exchange which corporately constructs the idea of objects, selves, persons. So in this view of what it means to be human, I don't get to just decide who I am and where I fit in the world. Other people's opinions about me matter. And the fact that, my friend might need me to do something for them does impact my decision making. I don't get to say, well, I'm Ellie and I never do that thing, so I'm just not going to do that thing because of who I am. The fact that I'm in this relationship with my friend and they want me to do something means that I have to go, well, maybe even though I didn't think this was part of who I am, my friend is asking me to do it. I'm in this relationship, maybe I should do it. Just puts the view of the self into question through being in relation. So now we come on to the second point in the three points that I was looking at a couple of slides ago. And this is the claim that the church has historically failed to promote relationality between people with and without disabilities. And here I'm drawing on Eastland's book, The Disabled God. Eastland makes 4 points that highlight how people with and without disabilities have often been pulled apart through church practice and through theology that the church has promoted. So first of all, the first point she makes is, she writes, the persistent thread within the Christian tradition has been that disability denotes an unusual relationship with God, and that the person with disabilities is either divinely blessed or damned, the defiled evildoer or the spiritual superhero. As is often the case with such starkly contrasting characterizations, neither adequately represents the ordinary lives and lived realities of most people with disabilities. And here you can see that if someone with a disability is portrayed as either super saintly or the defiled evildoer, they are separated from the rest of people who are just the normal people, who aren't either super saintly or super evil. And that creates a barrier between the people with disabilities and the people without disabilities. Another way that Eastland thinks this barrier has been created is that people with disabilities have been ostracized through the identification of disability with sin, or an identification of disability with a travesty of the divine image and an inherent desecration of all things holy. Now, often this is actually done quite subtly. People don't anymore, of course it was prevalent in the past, people don't anymore go up to someone with a disability and say, you have such and such a disability because of your sin. That doesn't tend to happen anymore. But there is this undercurrent of, oh, well, you know what, maybe this disability shows us the brokenness of the world. Well, you know, underneath that rhetoric lies, well, the brokenness of the world is sin. And so if you're saying that this disability shows us the brokenness of the world, you're saying that this disability shows us sin. So it's often articulated in very poetic ways, but underneath that is often this connection between disability and sin. And Eastland cites John 5:14 as an example of how the Bible identifies disability with sin. So she's not claiming that it's just Christians in church who have made this up. She says there are problematic passages in the Bible where people with disabilities are linked to, disability is linked to sin. And she also looks at Hebrews 9:13-14 as an example of how it identifies, how the Bible identifies disability with a travesty of the divine image and an inherent desecration of all things holy. We can go back to those passages if you want to later. So of course, again, thinking about this disconnect between people with disabilities and people without disabilities, if you're tarred with the brush of, you know, your disability shows up sin in some way or is a travesty of the divine image, and then the people without disability don't have that problem, then those relationships suffer as a result. The third point that Eastland makes is that in the Christian tradition, people with disabilities have been presented as having the opportunity to be ideals of virtuous suffering. And this is a very insidious, not tradition, but I guess habit that people have fallen into. You know, this idea that someone who's undergoing suffering because of chronic illness or because of disability, you know, but they bear it so well and they suffer patiently. They're being refined by God's fire, like silver held in the fire. They're being refined through their suffering, and they bear it so virtuously. And they're there to, you know, congregations then sometimes slip into saying, and this person can serve as an inspiration for the rest of us because they bear their suffering so patiently. Again, we can see that this way of seeing things causes a split between the person with the disability who's held up as this, you know, magnificently patiently suffering person, and the rest of the congregation, of the community. And we can talk more about that if you'd like to. And the fourth point that she makes is that the church has divorced the search for justice from charitable giving. And she talks about Amos, that famous passage about justice rolling down like rivers. And she notes that a lot of the prophets, when they talk about charitable giving, you know, giving to the needy at the gate and things like that, helping the needy at the gate, they talk about justice in the same breath. and that, yes, we need to help people, we need to give charitably, we need to sacrificially give, but we also need to seek justice for the people that we're trying to help. It's not just enough to give handouts, we need to redress the system in order to help those people. And she cites a lot of prophetic texts from the Old Testament in this argument, and says essentially what the problem is now is that when it comes to disability theology, the practices around disability in the church, is that people are happy to give money for a specific project or something, but they're not as happy to go on a march or sign a petition or set up a campaign to promote, for example, easy access to public buildings in their town. So something that might take a bit more effort, might take a bit more political engagement, people aren't so happy to do that. So the search for justice has been divorced from charitable giving, is her argument. And again, just to hammer my point home about this breaking down of relationality, the fact that people without disabilities aren't so engaged in the search for justice for people with disabilities breaks down the relationality between the two groups, who are then forced into being two groups, one rather than one cohesive whole. Actually, on that note, I should also say that I'm talking at the moment as though people with disabilities is this kind of hermetically sealed group that's apart from people without disabilities. Of course, that's not actually the case in real life, right? Easton refers to people as temporarily able-bodied. You can at any time pass from one group to the other through aging, through accident, through illness. It's not as if there's a sharp divide between the two groups. And also, people's experience of disability varies wildly. So for some people, a condition that they have might disable them on one day, but not on the next. And also someone's experience of, for example, blindness is totally different to someone else's experience of a mobility impairment. So I'm not saying that, people with disabilities is, here they are all over here in this nice tidy group. I'm not saying that at all, but just for the sake of the presentation here, I'm using this shorthand of people with and people without disabilities. So let's look now at a couple of models that have really influenced disability theology. So there are two main models of disability out there in sociology, history of disability, these other types of study of disability. There's the biomedical model of disability. Here, the disability is the problem and it needs to be fixed. The person with the disability is considered individually rather than part of a group of people with disabilities. And the person with the disability understands or is made to understand that he or she belongs to a devalued group. This is the work of Julie and David Smart in Models of Disability. So I imagine that people will recognize this model. There's a bar of normality. If you have a disability, you're kind of subpar. And in an ideal world, we fix that problem so that people can reach the bar of good normal health, maybe we'll call it, normality. So that's the biomedical model. On the other hand, over here, we have the socio-political model or minority model of disability. And here, it's the prejudice and discrimination that people with disabilities face that are the problem and which need to be fixed. In this model, people with disabilities view themselves as a minority group which is oppressed by the majority. And in this model, people with disabilities do not view themselves as belonging to an inferior or devalued group. It's rather that they are trying to fight to liberate themselves from the structures that impede them. So I think it's right at the beginning of the Baslin article that was set for the pre-reading. And again, apologies if you've had trouble accessing that, where he makes a very, and he admits it, a very basic example where he says, someone who uses a wheelchair to get about goes into a building And if there's and needs to get to the 10th floor. Now, if there's a lift, that person isn't disabled by the building. She can just get in the lift and go up to where she needs to go. If there's no lift, that person suddenly becomes disabled by the structure that's around her because she can't get up to the 10th floor. So it's the structures, it's the discrimination and the prejudice that are the disabling effects that the person will face through life. So those are two models that we can think about, talk about, critique. Let's come on to the third model that I want to look at today, which is Deborah Creamer's model of limitness. Now, it's important to note that when Creamer, and this is from her book, Disability in Christian Theology, when Creamer suggests this limitness model, she's saying she's not throwing away the medical and socio-political models out with the bathwater, as it were. She says they are really important and they help us to understand some basic truths that we need to think about. Firstly, the medical model makes us realize that there are indeed disabled bodies. This is a reality. We can't go through life thinking, well, you know, we're all kind of the same. We don't like to talk about, you know, some people being disabled and others not. It seems kind of mean. No, some bodies are disabled and we need to take that seriously if we're to live well together. The socio-political model makes us realize that there are justice concerns that arise when we realize that some people are being excluded and oppressed. This is also a reality. But, says Creamer, these models are insufficient theologically, and they don't engage in a profound theological way with disability. So what can we do? Well, Creamer wants to present her model, which she calls limitness or the limits model. And this model pays attention to what she calls the fluidity of human embodiment, and most particularly, the claim that limits are an unsurprising aspect of being human. Limits are normal. Rather than acting as a deficit, they lead us towards creativity and even towards God. So we'll explore a bit more what she means by that. So Creamer suggests that using the category of limit allows us to see all human beings as being no better or worse than we actually are. We all have limits. In other words, limitation is simply an ontological reality for humanity. It is part of being human. So she talks about human beings being not able to fly, for instance, or not being able to speak loudly enough to be heard on the other side of the world. We don't have those capacities. But interestingly, she talks about creativity in those circumstances. And she says, you know, the limits that we have, that we're not able to fly and we're not able to speak that loudly, helped us get the drive to invent the aeroplane and the telephone. And these inventions, these technologies helped us to overcome specific limits. And so in a way, the limits that we have sometimes push us to creatively overcome them and invent new technologies that help us. So we can talk to our friend in Australia, where before we couldn't. She argues that saying that someone is limited is usually negative, just in general. If you say you are limited, if I say you are limited, I'm implying something negative about you. I'm saying that you're lacking something. However, she then says that if we simply say that someone has limits, we are describing that person, neither positively or negatively. We're being purely descriptive. I can see Judy on my screen. Judy can't fly. I'm describing a limit that Judy has. And Creamer writes, this proposal suggests that limits, rather than being an array of unfortunate alternatives to omnipotence, are an unsurprising characteristic of human nature. So that's the first step in her argument. Limits are not surprising. They're just a part of the human experience. Oops. I didn't skip a slide, good. So this is a rather longer quote, but hold tight, it's worth it. Oh, I keep clicking on the wrong bit of the screen. Here we go. Limits are a normal and unsurprising aspect of life. Yet we choose, for whatever reason, to stigmatize some and normalize others. And of course you recognize this, right? We normalize the limit of not being able to fly, but we stigmatize the limit of not being able to walk, or not being able to eat on our own, or not being able to have what you might class as a normal conversation. When we dismiss disability as being an exceptional and othering experience, we deny the normality of limits in all our lives, pretend that we do not experience increasing limits as we age, and even refuse to acknowledge the future limit of death. In these denials, we live a lie that harms other people, those on whom we project and reject these limits. A lie that harms the environment when we pretend that it also has no limits, and a lie that harms even ourselves. We can no longer consider what it is to be embodied, to have race, gender, sexual orientation, power, politics, religion, without also considering what it is to have embodied limits. We can no longer ignore reflection on experiences of disability and other embodied limits in our theological constructions. We must attend to the values that we place on limits, including on people with visible and profound limits, and must challenge our notions of what it is to be normal. So Creamer here is making an impassioned plea to just think of people as having limits, and different people are going to have different limits. And another point in her book, she says, we all experience the limits of walking on a pavement that has a big drop off. If you've broken your ankle and you are using crutches for 6 weeks, you suddenly realize that this, the pavement design is a massive limiting factor in your life. Or if you're pushing a buggy with a kid inside it, you suddenly realize that this is a really limiting factor in your, the pavement thing is a limiting factor in your mobility, and you need to find the bit where the pavement goes down to the level of the road. And so there are moments in our lives when we realize, oh, I now have this extra limit, and it will go away when my kid is old enough to walk or when my ankle gets better. And so limits are also kind of temporal. We have them and then we don't have those same limits anymore, but we might get a different limit because of something that happens to us. And so she's really trying to say, again, limits are normal, and also they occur fluidly throughout life. And it's unhelpful if we pretend that they're not there. And it's unhelpful if we pretend that some of them aren't there, but others are there, and that those ones are really problematic. So I didn't make a slide about this, and perhaps I should have, but something else that Creamer is saying, when we were talking about creatively overcoming limits, right? Inventing the telephone so that we can speak to people far away. Often in Christian circles, disability is either seen as something that needs to be healed away. Let me pray for you and you'll be healed right now, and then everything will be fine. Or it's something to be passively endured, and this is where this model of virtuous suffering comes in again, passively endured, patiently. But there isn't that much room in theological discourse for someone who wants to creatively overcome the limits of their disability, who wants to say, well, I don't want to be disabled by the fact that my church doesn't have a disability accessible toilet. So I want to change that. There's not much space for that in Christian theology, this idea of creatively overcoming a limit. And so she really makes a point in her book about that, and how we need to think about which limits we want to try to creatively overcome and which limits we're happy to remain within. So that could be something that we discuss as well. Before we go on to the last slide, which is a couple of questions for people to consider before we have a big discussion together, I just wanted to ask if anyone has any questions about this specific quote, because it is pretty dense. Any questions about this particular quote? What does she mean, or any reactions to it? Yeah, Michelle?
Is it, or can it be seen as dismissive or offensive in any way to, I might have heard this wrong, but it feels like she's creating or trying to bring a leveling of limits. Is that dismissive to someone who has a really serious limit, to try and make it level to someone who has a very minor limitation?
Mm-hmm.
Because like you said, you know, even the frustration of pushing a buggy down a curb is probably very different to the frustration of being in a wheelchair and going down a curb. So where does she stand on that?
I think that's a really important point to highlight, actually, Michelle. So thank you very much for that. I think what she's not at all trying to do that, and I do agree that it can be read like that. I think what she's trying to say is, a lot of the time, we have this divide between people with disabilities and people without disabilities. And we see the people without disabilities as unlimited, as not having any limits. And we see the people with disabilities as having loads of limits. And she's saying, well, we need to scrap that, because it's evident that people without disabilities have limits. Clearly, we can't just deny that. But then, once we've got over that initial problem that separates people out and creates this us-them barrier, we do have to take all limits seriously and think about, you know, how they affect our lives. And the problem with not conceding that everybody has limits is that we, for instance, her point about the environment here, we pretend that the environment also doesn't have limits because this is something that we're so wedded to, the unlimitedness of humanity and its demands on nature. So I think the first step is to say everyone has limits, but she's not saying that all limits are the same. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, obviously that what you're saying is a truth. I'm just wondering how it's, I mean, it's such a deeply complex issue, isn't it, to, you know, because often if you're perceived as able-bodied, you know, without limits, often it's like when, you know, someone's died and people are frightened to say anything about, oh, I'm sorry for your grief or your loss. So you don't know how far to take that conversation. For me to say, I have been limited because I'm a woman in my search for vocational acknowledgement, you know, would someone who has been limited very physically all their life be like, whatever, that's nothing compared to what I'm going through? Do you know what I mean? There's just that.
Yeah, and that's such a great point. And I think what Creamer is hoping for is that once people start saying, well, I've, you know, experienced this limit that's because I'm a woman, people don't take me seriously, or because I'm this, that, and the other, these are the problems that I've encountered, that then we actually all think about those together, and the person with the disability can say, well, yeah, people think that I have no authority. This is a real anecdote. People think I have no authority because I can't stand up in church at the front. Yeah. And that's, you know, if we start having those conversations, people who have faced limits and often not talked about them will then be able to say, well, this is my experience of a limit and how people perceive me because of those limits. And what she says here towards the end, we can no longer ignore reflection on experiences of disability and other embodied limits in our theological constructions. She's saying we have to take other embodied limits, like being a woman is often considered to be a limit. We can't ignore reflection on these things when we do our theological constructions. So she's kind of
and
calling.
So actually, it goes both ways, doesn't it? That you know, if people with physical limits think that because you can walk, you don't have any limits in your life, that that conversation can go both ways, can't it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And often the flip side of the coin is that, you know, she's saying we stigmatize some limits. So often, you know, we'll see someone who has a very obvious disability. You know, we see that they're blind because they have a guide dog, or we see that they have a mobility impairment because they're in a wheelchair, and we think, oh, that person is so limited, you know. And she's saying, well, that's because we've stigmatized that limit. And yes, it's probably really frustrating, and they probably face all kinds of problems in their lives. But actually, if you talk to them, they might tell you about other, you know, parts of their lives where they have an experience that you might not expect. Or I think it's this whole stigmatization thing that she's trying to work around. Judy, and I'm afraid I can't see lots of you on the screen, so you might just have to unmute and talk. But Judy, I can see you.
Yeah, I was just thinking of we've been going to New Wine since 1994 or something, and when there was a time for people to come forward for prayer, there was a couple who wheeled a severely disabled girl who over the years we saw grow to be a woman to the front for prayer, and everybody assumed who didn't know that they were taking this girl up for prayer for healing for her disability. And actually, we got talking to them one day, and the mum was really sort of quite frustrated, and she said, no, we always take her up for prayer for her to be blessed. No other reason. She may be disabled to everybody on the outside, but she sees angels. And she knows who Jesus is. She is happy, she's secure, she's safe. And I think it taught me quite a lot, really, about our own perceptions of what disability is. And it's sort of been something that's been with me even before that, but particularly with that. But I think as well that there are so many hidden disabilities. You know, what about people who are going through trauma? I mean, that's really limiting. People who've been abused, people who've got mental health issues, you know, things like ME, where folk have, you know, there's a whole debate, isn't there, about is ME psychological or is it organic? And all of those things, when we talk about those things, they can have a really negative impact on the way that we view those people.
I think you're right about that, you know, our perceptions of each other. And this is, you know, I hasten to add, this is not just about the perception of people without disabilities of those with disabilities. You know, it's every which way. This is not a kind of just two-dimensional discussion here. That certainly we make assumptions about people all the time, whether it's because it's something that we can see about them or something that we just feel that we, you know, I don't like that person very much for some reason. You know, we just make assumptions about people all the time. And I think that Creamer's work helps us think about that. What behaviors, she's talking about limits specifically, that we stigmatize some and normalize others, but also what behaviors do we stigmatize and what behaviors do we normalize? I think it's an interesting question. I was going to say something else, but it's totally gone out of my mind, so it might come back. We'll see. Does anyone have any other questions or comments specifically about this quote?
Just say something, Ellie, if I might. I mean, I was just going to comment on the fact that there is quite a tradition of the voluntary acceptance of limitations in the Christian tradition for the purposes of spiritual development. Let's call it that. Not generally physical. Well, I mean, but by nature of our being embodied, they're kind of physical. I mean, fasting, living in the middle of nowhere or whatever. So there's that. And also we know artistically that often the acceptance of limitations is seen as really creative by artists of one kind or another. On the other hand, there is a strong tradition in the Christian tradition of healing, isn't there? I mean, it's already been alluded to. I mean, but Jesus does, after all, heal disabled people. So how does it all fit together? You don't have to answer all in one go.
There's a great paper that's coming out, I really hope soon, on, I see your hand, Paul, I'll get to you, on prayer and healing in the charismatic evangelical tradition in Britain. It's going to be a great paper. I don't know where it's going to be published yet. I've seen the first draft, and it's going to be great. And this researcher has done some qualitative study for women in the charismatic evangelical tradition in the UK, and they all identify as having a disability, variously visible and non-visible types of disability, and they all recount being prayed for healing against their will. And it's shocking. It's shocking stuff. But you're right that we have these biblical narratives of healing, and that's what propulses people to go up to someone and say, well, you know, I'm being a gospel bearer. I want to pray for you for healing. And a lot of what comes out of this research is that people say, the people that are interviewed say, I would love to be prayed for, but I want, you know, to be prayed for my relationship with my mum, or I want to be prayed for, you know, we're going through a tough time and financially things are really rocky, and I want prayer for that and a sense of peace. Or, you know, I want to be prayed for, but I don't want other people to assume what I want prayer for. I want a conversation. And that really highlights what Eastland gets at with that disconnect idea between people with and without disabilities, that there's no, often, I'm generalizing, but there's often no conversation before the assumption of, oh, I see you, I see what you are, and I know what you want prayer for. There's no entering into a real conversation. Who are you? How are you doing? Would you like me to pray for you? What might you want me to pray for you about? You know? Yeah, I hope that vaguely answers. Oh, the question of limitation. Yeah, that's really interesting. The desert fathers and fasting and so on. I think that is really interesting, and she doesn't talk about this as far as I can recall, but I wonder whether she would say, you know, yes, because limitedness, she often calls it limitness, is part of who we are as humans, and therefore to kind of emphasize that to ourselves might bring home to us who we are more clearly as creatures of God. She might want to say that, but I'm kind of hypothesizing there.
Ellie?
Yes?
It's Rosemary.
Yeah.
It was interesting, the eye clinics that went to parts of Africa removing cataracts. They found after a while that many of those who have had their cataracts removed so they could see became very, very depressed, which you think would be the opposite. But when you think about it, that's totally changed their lives. Living in an African village, they would have been looked after by the community, by the family around them. Once they could see, they would have to be much more independent, and that's probably very frightening.
Yeah, that's helpful, Rosemary. I think it taps into this relationality idea that's really core to a lot of what happens in disability theology. This acknowledgement that actually human beings are interdependent. Often we like to think of ourselves as being totally autonomous from one another, but actually that's not the reality. And when we're forced into more autonomy and independence, often that's not what helps us to flourish. I would also say, though, that there are a lot of people who have been healed or cured, depending on how you want to say it, of their disability, either through miraculous healings or through medical intervention, and who say, this is great. You know, some people with disabilities say, I don't want this to change. I want other things in my life to change. I don't want my disability to change. It's part of who I am. Others say, yes, get me out of here. Like, let me have whatever it is again that I want. I want a cochlear implant so that I can hear. This is a huge debate, of course, within the deaf community. I see you, Jane, but Paul had his hand up, so let's go to Paul and then Jane, if you have a question.
I wanted to, I've listened very carefully to what, what you've said and the way you presented it. I just wanted to say that, that I am a disabled person, and I'm in close relationships with someone who also is. And it's just the experience of being here today in this context and listening to what's been said. It feels like being an alien. It's like we're talking about a different species. It's I found it quite a difficult experience in some ways. It's like talking about me, but in a way that's sort of detached, and I don't know. It's quite a strange experience, really. Anyway, I just wanted to learn that.
Well, thanks for your comment, Paul. I think I'm sorry that it's a difficult experience. That's really unfortunate. I think that partly that reflects the breadth of experience that comes with various types of disability, that, any portrayal or discussion of anything that touches on disability is always going to speak partially, isn't it? It's never going to be the whole story. So hopefully maybe we can have a conversation about how this could be a fuller discussion. Yeah, thank you for that. Jane, was that a question or not?
No, I was just reacting to your thing about cochlear implants, which I know is a huge debate in the deaf community, because the implication is that they're not fully valid people if they're deaf, and that they have to become like hearing people, like everybody else. And I just know it's a very contested thing at the moment.
And that's the medical model again, right? That if you're, for whatever reason, below the bar, and if you can get to the bar, that's what you should do. There's a really great documentary called Life or Deaf, or Life and Deaf. I think it was aired on Channel 4 originally. I'm not sure where it can be found now, but it's really interesting. It follows the lives of 4 young people in a deaf community in London, I think. One of whom decides that she does want to have a cochlear implant, and another of whom decides that she doesn't. And it's their sort of just a documentary about these 2 people and the wider group as well, and how it affects their relationships with their parents and things like that. It's really interesting. I can see we have some stuff in the chat. Yeah, Michelle, that's a really good point. Jesus asked the blind man what he wanted Jesus to do for him. There's that kind of attempt at conversation and relationality first. Yeah. Okay, thanks for that as well, Keith and Judy. Let me press on then to the next slide. So let's talk about ideas about relationality and limits. So in groups, I can't see what time it is because I'm screen sharing. How much time do we have, Keith? Oh.
It's almost 12:15.
Oh, okay,
Ellie.
Great. We have some time. So let's put you in breakout groups, but let's, if you're able to just jot down what I'd like you to talk about. Discuss how taking seriously both our need for being in relation that we've talked about and our limits might change how we think about church in this pandemic and beyond. So here's where we get to the what could this theology mean for thinking about being church in the pandemic? What specific changes might this reflection bring to your own communities? So here I'm asking you to just take some of these ideas and apply them to thinking about being church in the pandemic and beyond the pandemic as we emerge from it, hopefully. And do you see any specific changes that these ideas might make in your specific context? So I'll stop sharing so I can see everyone. Let me just put you in breakout rooms, and we'll do 10 to 15 minutes in breakouts and then come back. Are people happy with that? We'll have some time for some plenary. Just assigning some people to different groups. Here we go. All right, off you go. Would anyone from room 1 like to begin? That's Catherine, Dawn, Jane, and Judy. If no one wants to, that's fine. Oh, Judy, go ahead.
Go on. You might not like what I'm going to say.
That's fine.
We had a very frank conversation about disability, people's perceptions, how it makes us feel. We talked a bit about the pandemic, maybe forcing people to disclose a hidden disability, and that they have chosen perhaps to keep to themselves, and what that means to people who've been put in that position. I don't like what Cream has got to say. I think for lots of reasons, and too many reasons to go into here really, but I think there are lots of different views about disability and how to speak about it, how to help to dispel the myths. And I don't think it's about, personally, it's about us dispelling the myths and being more sensitive and less preoccupied about how to fix people, because that is certainly not what needs to be done.
You so far that doesn't go against Creamer, but I maybe you're just being polite and you don't want to articulate those arguments. But I would also say any robust argument is a good argument. I don't really care what you think, as long as you can tell me why you think it, you know, and really back it up. So don't be afraid to disagree with anything. You know, that's the basis of a good conversation. So please don't be hesitant about that. Any more for any more from group 1? Otherwise, in room 2, we had Femi, Helen, Linda, and Michael. Any feedback there for the group on what these ideas could feed into for what it means to be church, these ideas of relationality and limit?
We spoke more about the pandemic situation and how we felt about that and about coming out of it and doing church more normally again, actually being with people face to face. And we discussed anxiety about maybe entering a crowded situation, not so much because of the virus, but just because we haven't been in that situation for such a long time, and it raises anxiety levels, and that in itself is a limit.
Absolutely.
You know, there are people who live with these anxiety issues all the time, and that's a limit for them.
Certainly, and I think what you're touching on there is that a lot of what's happened in the pandemic and what will happen as we ease out of it, that a lot more people will experience aspects of what life is like often for people with various disabilities. So, you know, we might experience anxiety about returning to a crowded room or going to a restaurant or something. And in that experience, we get a glimpse into an anxiety disorder that someone might live with permanently. And that might help conversations and understandings grow between people, I think. And this idea of a lot of people who've had long COVID have said, now I understand a bit more, you know, what it's like to live with a chronic illness, because I thought that illnesses lasted 2 weeks if you're really unlucky. And now I've had long COVID and it lasted 10 months. And so I understand what it is a bit more to live with a longer term condition. So I'm not saying COVID is a good thing. I'm the last person to say that COVID is a good thing. But I think that some of the experiences that people have had might help foster conversation. And talking about going back to church in an on-site building, I think one of the conversations that needs to be had is how that will play out for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses who some of them can't make it to an on-site building and have just found this whole online church thing and the proliferation of online churches that we've seen to be extremely helpful, beneficial, a major resource. Now, there were, of course, online churches often set up by people with disabilities way before the pandemic, way before the pandemic. And what Tim Hutchinson was hinting at yesterday when he said that, you know, every online church pretends it's the first online church. When the Church of England launched its Everybody Welcome Online thing back in last April or something, those documents pretended or seemed to pretend that no one had ever done online church before. And it caused a massive backlash in online churches run by people with disabilities who said, well, we've been doing this for years. And you, Church of England, did not consult any of us when you did your Everybody Welcome Online document. What's going on? You'll see in the reading list, you have a book by a really small pamphletty book by Katie Tuplin, Worship and Disability. It's super basic, but it's really worth the read. She was one of the people who responded to the Everybody Welcome Online launch by going, what? This has been happening for years and years, and you've pretended that it's totally new. So I think there's a lot of conversations that need to still happen between people who have been doing online church for a very long time for various reasons and people who have kind of just discovered it during this pandemic. That was a little bit off topic, sorry. Thank you for that helpful comment about trying to go back to things and experiencing anxiety and things. It's really helpful insights there. In group C, we had Jeff, Mary and Pete and Susie. Anything you'd like to share with the group from you?
Yeah, I started off wondering what we were going to talk about, but then I found lots of interesting parallels. So it was a worthwhile session. Not everybody's disability is the same. Not everybody's experience of pandemic has been the same. Sometimes we don't move quickly enough to look for technological ways around a limitation. We didn't move quickly enough to offer people CD players so they could play CDs at services. But we also didn't necessarily ask them if that's what they wanted. Did they want us to sort them out? And also the fact that, like you say, people have been doing online church for ages, and for some people that's all they can access. We have to acknowledge that although we who will aim to go back into the building, see going into the building as first class and online church as second class, for some people, they don't want to be thought of as doing it second class. Some of the rest of the group might want to modify some of those comments.
That's really helpful, Mary. Yeah, anyone else? Jeff?
Just an observation that there is a new category of disabled, which is technologically disabled. I mean, I say it's new, but it's come into much stronger focus. That there are people who are simply unable to access the things that are offered online.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does the church cater to that in a time when so much is happening online? That's been a big question for a lot of communities this past year. Yeah, it's really, really good point. We have a few more minutes. Yes. Group 4. Does anyone want to? Oh, Keith, before we go to group 4. Do group 4 first. He's gesticulating. Michelle, Paul, and Rosemary.
Have we focused on the being in relation quite a lot? And I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg there, because if you're not in relation with anyone with what you would class as a limit or a disability, then you may not think about how to make your church accessible for that. But then when you are in relationship with someone, then you think about it. If it's someone you love, then you want to make provision for that person, and that is the point, isn't it? If we were in relationship with one another and we were loving one another irrespective of limits, then we would be making sure that there was provision for everyone, which is the point of loving your neighbour as yourself, of being inclusive, of just being mindful. But we talked about the fact that it takes time and energy, it demands effort of us, and most of the time I think basically we're lazy as human beings, and we don't want to put in the time and the effort and allow God to bring the disruption and interrupt our lives, because it demands a response from us, very much like the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the people who couldn't be bothered to go out of their way and probably what they planned or what they were on their way to do in order to stop and help their brother, their neighbour.
And perhaps this is where some of what Kathy Ross was saying yesterday about community feeds in, that if you, I'm thinking in a specific church and community model here. So if you're a church that has a lot of things going on in the community, lots of activities to which you're going to meet your local community and engage with them, then that setting up of relationality will then mean that you meet everyone in your community and that you engage with them, and then you think, well, okay, well, this person that I've just met in the knitting club, how are they going to feel if they walk into the church? You know, is the music going to be too loud? Are the lights going to be too bright? Or on the other hand, are they not going to be able to read the order of service because the print is so tiny? You know, through knowing people in the community who might need access to your building, you then begin to ask those kinds of questions. But if, as you say, if you don't know the people, you don't know what needs you're trying to meet. I can see something in the chat. Do we ever ask people in our churches who consider they have a disability and are prepared to talk about it, what would be helpful to them? Then do we do anything about it? Those are two totally different questions, right, Julie? You know, having the conversation and then going, oh, it was lovely to have this conversation. Yeah. Helpful, thank you. Pete?
We just have had a problem with our loop system. We had the church refurbished, and it was turned out that the folk who were using the loop didn't tell us that it wasn't turned on again. With just a flicking of a switch, they've been sitting there for weeks without even hearing anything. They just didn't want to be difficult, and thought they were going to cause us trouble if we weren't, you know, if it hadn't gone well. And so actually we don't know what people need unless they come forward. And there's something I was saying in my group a bit about with other liberation theologies, that sometimes the folk who suffer the oppression in the broader sense of the word can be perpetuating that oppression because they can't or don't feel able to speak out. And it was a very easy fix. It's like I was a miracle worker. I flicked the switch and it all came to life and it was fine. But I don't know, because I hear okay at the moment. So there's something, how do we encourage folk to speak up without feeling that they're being difficult, or making them to feel that they're being difficult?
That's such a good question, and what you outline is such a common problem, right? That, you know, people don't want to be a nuisance, and if you've been made to feel as though you're a nuisance in any different context, then you know, you internalize that and you think, well, last time I did that, I was made to feel as though I was a bit of a nuisance, so I just won't say anything this time. So it's about changing the entire culture as much as we can in any space we inhabit to say, you know, well, please don't. Let's not perpetuate these messages that make people think as though they're a nuisance when they ask for something, or, you know, and it's a very, very, very long-term job. Yeah. Keith, you were waving.
I'm not sure if I might be on the wrong track here, but I was just thinking about, you know, what is it that leads disabled people to be, or people who are obviously disabled anyway, to be kind of othered. And I'm guessing it's something to do with fear, you know, on the part of the rest of the community. And I just think there's is there a parallel with where we are at the moment in the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, where we've been forced to see other people as threatening, have we not, in some ways, in a way that we do not normally? I mean, because we might get COVID from them, and we've got to keep 2 meters away from them. And whilst that's perhaps has less impact on the way we see those we already love and are close to, strangers, you know, I want to keep away from them. I might get unhappy if they get too close. So I'm just wondering if there's anything, I haven't really thought about this. I'm just wondering if there's anything in that comparison.
Yeah, any thoughts on that, the parallels? I hadn't made that connection before, Keith, but I think I wonder whether the uncomfortableness that people with visible disabilities often have to deal with is that people just feel awkward around them. They don't know what to say or to do. Yeah, Rosemary.
That exposes our own vulnerability, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite possibly the basis of the fear of getting involved with disabled people and giving time and effort.
Yeah. Paul?
Just reflecting on that and on what Keith has said, and also that idea about the loop system and not wanting to draw attention. I mean, to me, both those things are going in the same direction, in that what for me it points to is the quality or the nature of the relationship. Because in both those cases, if we were talking about it in the context of a family, neither of those things would be so. In a family, the idea of being uncomfortable with someone disabled wouldn't be so. And if someone couldn't hear in a family, they would tell you. So disability has a way of actually focusing on the quality of our relationships. It's almost like a mirror at which we need to look at. Anyway, that's just a thought.
Yeah, Pete, you want to come back?
I agree entirely with that, Paul. There's going to be a however. I think also that it becomes a bit of a third rail. I sense this, especially with folk who don't hear well. Their levels of anger and frustration can be quite high often. And I think in this case, in my defense, it was more of a channel of their frustration with life, because they know that I could have fixed it or done something to fix it. So it's not a straightforward, if only they could have told me, I could have done something about it. I think there's something about that we're complicated people, and it's a little bit like the language we use around race, isn't it? How do we, people don't want to get involved because they're not sure, they don't want to get it wrong, so they do nothing. And it's more about how do we encourage folk to be genuine, but also to know that it's not transactional in that sense. I don't think. Am I making any sense at all? I am to myself, but that's quite common.
Yeah. Keith, do you want to come in?
I don't know. Again, I'm just feeling for something here, but I'm linking the last 2 points a little bit to. I mean, I believe I believe there is a bit of a thing within the world of disability. That's a phrase in itself, isn't it? But but around reappropriating, and more positively or more defiantly terminology that that is regarded as unacceptable, like cripple, for example. Yeah. As a kind of almost a kind of badge of defiant pride or something like that. And I'm not quite, having said that, I'm suddenly not quite sure how that relates, but I think there's something there which needs to be taken seriously, I think.
You're absolutely right that there's been a move in recent years to move from talking about people with disabilities to disabled people, so that the adjective comes first, and that's very generational. So younger people tend to prefer disabled person, older people tend to prefer person with disability. The person with disability argument is that they want to highlight the person, the shared humanity, and the generally younger trend is to highlight, well, this is who I am, and if you don't like it, you can just go away. And that's quite a lot to do with the rise of identity politics. And we see the same trend in LGBTQI communities in terms of how people choose to define themselves. So I think that's a really interesting, I don't want to say progression, but trend difference in trends.
It's also partly about this awkwardness thing, isn't it? It's about saying, okay, because there is a tendency, perhaps we have to, as it were, pretend not to have noticed. There's an awkwardness which arises out of that. And, there's an awkwardness which arises out of thinking, oh God, am I allowed to talk about that? Am I allowed, is this something we're on? But actually there's that other response which says, don't try and pretend it's not happening or I'm not here. And that's kind of part of what lies behind that reappropriation of that sort of what had become inappropriate language, I think.
Although that speaks against what you've just said about what Creamer's views, doesn't it? Creamer's views about speaking about the limitation, not the person. To identify as I am a disabled person feels like the opposite to that, rather as opposed to saying I'm a person with limits. To say I'm a limited person feels, like two polar opposites.
I think it's more that it's this progression that we've noticed within the field, that Creamer is one of the older generation of writers here, and so she would prefer person with disabilities, person with limits. And if you look at some of the newer writers, they would go for disabled person. But I don't think it's polar opposites. I think it's a shift in emphasis.
I don't think it's progression though. I think some of it is basically to do with like fads, and fashion isn't the right word, but styles, because years ago you did say disabled person and then that became politically incorrect, and to say a person with disability was the politically correct, and to now go back to disabled person, it's just life goes in those cycles as well. And
I think it does, and we do need to close. I have my eye on the clock. I'm going to use my prerogative of presenter to just close with this comment, that I think it makes a big difference who's doing the talking.
Yeah, definitely.
If it's someone choosing to define themselves in one way, then yeah, so that can be problematic. I'm not saying we all get to always choose to define who we are constantly, because of this relationality concept that is important. But I think it does matter who's doing the talking, and if someone with, as I would want to say, someone with a disability says, well, I just want to be talked about as a disabled person, then I would say, I'm going to listen to that choice that you've made, and not say, well, I think that, you know, you're regressing into a state that we've moved beyond, right? On that note, I can see that there's stuff in the chat, but I'm afraid we don't have time to really get to it. But do please remember that tomorrow morning we'll have time to talk about things, and that you will indeed be asked to contribute a question or a comment, something that's arisen this week, to feed into our conversation tomorrow. Right, let me end the recording.